The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we will be speaking with Ambassador Robert Hunter. He has an impressive public service record and has served in multiple presidential administrations. He was Clinton's ambassador to NATO. He was on Carter's National Security Council. He is a prolific writer as well. And today's program, we're going to be dedicating to President Jimmy Carter, who died in December of 2024. Ambassador Hunter, welcome to the program from Washington.
Well, thank you very much, Doug and Michael. And I want to say I admire what the two of you do down at Troy University, which sets a very high standard for discussion, open-mindedness, and looking at solid analysis of the United States role in the world, which unfortunately we don't see everywhere in the country. So it's an honor for me to be with you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Hunter, I would like to ask you, first off, what was it like to work on President Carter's National Security Council, and how did he manage the Oval Office? And what were some of the important security principles that guided him during his time in office?
Well, Jimmy Carter had a very good reputation with almost everybody for what he did after the presidency. But I think he deserves a lot more credit for what he did as president. He was a person who was incidentally very open to people from the staff. I worked for Speaker Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor, but I had a lot of face time with the president, which nowadays probably doesn't happen because we were a total of 60 people back then, and now it's 600, which is a grave difference. Carter was also somebody willing to have people push back at him. If you disagreed with him, he didn't want to be told what he already knew. He didn't want to be told something that was just going to work to his ego. He knew that as President of the United States, he was going to have to serve American interests in the world as best as he can. And in order to do that, he had to have good information. He had to have good advice. He was going to make the decisions, but he wanted to know what the alternatives were. And one thing you always had to worry about him is that anything you wrote that went to the president, he read. And that meant if you wrote something very long, he was going to read it. And he would, in addition to taking on the substance, he would find typos and misspellings and that sort of thing, which proved he read it. His line was, if it's important enough for somebody to write this to me, it's important enough for me to read it. Somebody criticized him for maybe being a bit down in the weeds, but it meant that when he got his arms around a foreign policy issue, I'll let other people speak to the domestic, he knew what he was talking about. He didn't have to let other people coach him step by step, which has been true that every other president I think I've known, with the possible exception of Bill Clinton, who himself was a very, very thorough study. But Jimmy Carter was a person who took very seriously the job of doing his best for the country and knowing his brief. And I saw that numerous times, both the 2 years I was in charge of Europe for him under Brzezinski, and the 2 years in the Middle East, consequential in both areas at the time.
Excellent, thank you. Ambassador Hunter, what were Carter's most lasting accomplishments, and what did Carter accomplish that is most often missed today?
I think there's common agreement that his most important achievement was at Camp David and leading up to the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. This was something which had been festering for decades. Carter had the wit, after President Sadat of Egypt determined that something fundamentally had to change. Carter risked his presidency on bringing both Sadat and Menachem Begin from Israel. It was a really tough nut. I got to know both of them quite well, I think. Both of them to Camp David for 13 days. The two leaders from the Middle East actually met only twice. Once right at the beginning, when they had a handshake to say hello, and once at the end. Otherwise, it was Carter moving back and forth from different lodgings at Camp David. I was not involved in Middle East at that point. I only took over the account immediately after the signing of the peace deal. And Carter was the person who was in charge of the drafts, with inputs from an extraordinary team of people in the U.S. government on the Middle East, which has not been matched since. The team there is today is really not in the league of what Carter had. And he persevered over 13 days. And when he came down from the mountain with the two of them, and they went into the Rose Garden and announced they had the Camp David Accords, that fundamentally transformed the geostrategic situation of the Near East, not just as between those two countries, but in terms of U.S. relations, confrontation, whatever you want to say, with the Soviet Union.
Fantastic. Ambassador Hunter, you worked to develop the Carter Doctrine. What were the security objectives that motivated this doctrine? And in retrospect, how do we assess its impact on the world today?
When I was in charge of the Middle East, there were only, incidentally on the staff, there were only two of us handling the Middle East and North Africa. My number two had the Iran account. A man named, he was a retired naval captain, Gary Sick, and he was the one who dealt with the day-by-day of this extraordinary period of the 444 days of the hostage crisis, which everybody remembers. And when I was working with the rest of the Middle East, it was not bogged down in the day-to-day details of what you do with the Iranians or try to get this thing resolved. And it occurred to me that we needed a broader framework for dealing with that issue and for the entire region. So I got together a very small group of people in my office at the old executive office building. I got Bob Ames, who was the National Intelligence Officer for at the CIA for the Middle East, who tragically was blown up in the embassy in Beirut in 1983. I got somebody from the State Department at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level, and I got somebody from the Office of Secretary of Defense, a man named Robert Murray, who went on to be Secretary of the Navy, I believe it was, and then somebody from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so the five of us met together regularly in my office, and I had this idea. We would really need to have something, we'll call it the Carter Doctrine, which gave a broader framework. And we devised the major elements of that, just the five of us, and then went out and began to try to sell those elements to our respective parts of the government. And it would have, and I can talk to you about the methodology if you'd like, but the remarkable thing, which many people forget about, is here you had the Soviet Union had recently invaded Afghanistan, taken it over. You had the United States being confronted by Iran holding our hostages. And there was a deep concern in the government, which a lot of people now poo-poo, that Russia might then move into Iran as well. And the basic thing that was involved in this was to send a clear message to the Soviet Union. Afghanistan so far, but no farther. And I can't think of anything in history in which a country, the United States, being beleaguered by another country, Iran, that took a stand in its security, because the recognition that if the Soviet Union controlled Iran, all kinds of things would have been incredible jeopardy, including the flow of oil, most important, but also upset to the entire region. And the way it happened is when I had this set of ideas, I'm sorry to go on about it, but it's kind of important. I sent a memorandum to Brzezinski, and this was at the beginning of 1980, and Spig said, do me a memo for the president. And I sat down and I said, oh, to hell with it. I'm not going to do a memo. I'm going to do it in the form of a speech, laying it all out. But it so happened at that moment, Carter was busy at work on the 1980 State of the Union. So Brzezinski went into this meeting with Carter and people from state and defense and all that, and he put my draft on the table, and Carter read the State Department draft, and he said, I'm going to go with the NSC draft. Threw away the State Department draft. And that, in effect, go back and read the 1980 State of the Union. That was the State of the Union address. Now, to be fair, Brzezinski wrote the key paragraph, which in effect said, if anything the Russians do against Iran or in the region, we'll consider it an attack on ourselves, and the balloon's going to go up. Be damn careful. So that became the framework for all of U.S. foreign policy in the Persian Gulf region, which lasted, that was 1980, till 1991, 11 years, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and hence you no longer needed the Carter Doctrine. A lot of people have misrepresented it, but that is in effect what it was and how it happened. And I have to say I was quite proud of the role I was able to play. But we were able to do it because we were not in the day-to-day firing line on Iran, and I got together the people who were necessary from the other parts of the government who were necessary to work out an internal agreement. So when it went to the president, we were confident it was going to get the support of state, CIA, of course, which was going to be giving the logic basis, and then the two parts of the Pentagon, the civilian and the military. And that's the way it happened.
That's actually a very great story. I'm going to follow that up and ask about how the Iran hostage crisis affected President Carter and what strategic changes did he implement following the Iranian Revolution.
Well, as I say, I was not the lead on that. But when the Ayatollah Khomeini went back to Iran, I'm trying to remember the exact date, the beginning of 78, 68, 78, I guess it was. Is that right? The French, incidentally, our good friends, the French, facilitated that. And one thing the French did not tell us, the French had their doctors working with the Shah on his cancer. The French did not tell us he had cancer. Okay? So part of the problem is the Shah was very sick. And there was, at the beginning of this, as the Ayatollah, who didn't give a damn about Iran, just like the current Ayatollah doesn't give a damn about Iran. They are parasites with their fundamentalist view of Islam going back to the 7th century, if you can believe that, just happen to be using Iran as their host and have been progressively helping to destroy the country because they don't care about it. So there was actually an occupation of the U.S. Embassy early on in the time in which the Ayatollah was in charge. The United States made remonstrances, that's the word, and they got out. The triggering event later in the year was when, with the cancer diagnosis for the Shah, he decided he was going to get treatment in the West and left Iran and went to 2 or 3 places. And then Carter was put under intense pressure, particularly by David Rockefeller and some others, to bring the Shah into the United States for treatment in New York. And Carter, against his better judgment, acceded to that. One of the times he probably should have dug in his heels and said, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm not going to run the risk. And a few days later, the so-called students occupied the U.S. Embassy and took, 52 people in the embassy hostage. It was a larger number, and they let a few of them go and kept them prisoner there for 444 days. So that became, during that period, and as I said, I had a watching brief. I didn't play the central role that my colleague Gary Sick did. Up to that point, the most intense diplomatic exercise in all of U.S. history. But the Ayatollah wasn't going to be prepared to give in. In fact, there were a series of points along the way in which there could have been a break in the negotiating process. But what the Ayatollah did is he kept going step by step. He wanted to get a new constitution. He wanted to get his new president. It was only when he had his own instruments in place to run Iran and was confident of that we got to the point, and I wasn't a negotiator, later Secretary of Defense, come up with a name, what's the name, Warren Christopher was the primary negotiator. And by August or September of that year, there was the framework of an agreement. And then the Ayatollah decided to keep the prisoners until after the American election to kind of get at Jimmy Carter. And we later learned that the people working for Reagan, centered on the head of the CIA, Bill Casey, was having back-channel talks with the Iranians to say, if you keep the hostages till after the election, you'll get a better deal out of Reagan. And that's called treason. All right. Of course, it was a parallel to what was done under the preceding president with Lyndon Johnson, in which there was treason committed by the widow of Claire Chennault. And all this stuff is on the record. So then Carter, of course, lost the election. But even though this was an important event, the real reason, in my judgment, sitting there and doing analysis of a whole wide variety of things, the thing that killed Carter was double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, and double-digit interest rates. That was enough to knock off any president. And the hostage crisis thing was icing on the cake. And as you know, the hostages were released 1 minute after the change in government in the United States. But Carter did everything he could. Now, one thing I was not involved in, I didn't even know about, was the hostage rescue mission, which was, in my judgment, when I learned about it afterwards, was a really cockamamie idea that was forced on in part by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and by a few others. I think Brzezinski backed it. And in my judgment, never had a chance of succeeding. But it may have actually saved the hostages' lives, because as we were reading the intelligence, we were beginning, Gary Sick and I were beginning to pick up an increased threat, possibly, that some of the Iranians would start killing hostages. But afterwards, the United States, having done this particular thing, the hostages were then broke up into small clusters. And I think the failed hostage rescue mission actually saved lives of the hostages. Can't prove it. And of course, all of this is intensely political in our domestic politics. But there you were. Carter did his level best to try to get these people out without anybody being killed. And he succeeded. And nobody got killed. I mean, there are a lot of games being played. I'm trying to think of it. Ross Perot supposedly got some of his people from his firm that were in Iran, and he got 3 of them out. Never happened. Okay, never happened. The only people that got out were the ones the Canadians to the embassy managed to smuggle out, which thanks be to Canada. But this is one of those things which will haunt us for a long time. And what actually happened still is not in the public domain. But so what? It was icing on the cake and helped defeat Jimmy Carter, and then we got Ronald Reagan, and we were off and running in terms of a lot of very damaging things to the American economy. Reagan and Maggie Thatcher did a lot of damage to the two countries, but that's politics.
Ambassador Hunter, in the few minutes that we have left, I would like to ask you your assessment on Jimmy Carter's legacy and what should we take away from his legacy as president and the years after he was president as well.
Well, his legacy as president gets reviewed all the time and looks better and better compared to many, if not most, of his successors. He was a man who definitely put human rights and the moral dimension more firmly on the American agenda, which has been forgotten about. If you look at where we are today, morality has been thrown out the window. Human rights is thrown out the window. USAID is being destroyed, okay, etc. But Jimmy Carter, without the debate that will have to go on about his presidency, in which I think he got a bum deal. Afterwards, with the Carter Center, he went to more than 100 different countries. They've done astounding things in the world. There are 1,700 people, almost none of them are in Atlanta, who are desperately involved in that. And he got rid of a number of diseases, like guinea worm, schistosomiasis. Some of the things that have plagued people in Africa don't exist anymore because of the personal role of Jimmy Carter. His view was, I'm an ex-president, and when I show up in these countries that aren't doing anything, they pay attention. They have to pay attention to it. And I think there is a consensus now that he was the most astounding ex-president we ever had. Didn't go out to make a lot of money, continued to live in the house he always had, continued to teach Sunday school, taught Sunday school in the Maranatha Baptist Church for 50 years. I had the honor to be down there at a place called Troy University, which you probably heard of, and I decided, well, why don't I go over to Plains for Sunday school? So I did that. I managed to get over to Plains, and I had a friend there who got me a nice seat in his teaching of Sunday school, and incidentally, there's a recording of it, and he was very nice to me because I'd had a long-standing relationship with. He was always very good to my wife too, who was Iranian. And he was extremely supportive of her. Didn't have to be. He was. And he made a couple of nice mentions to me in his Sunday school. Then I met with him and Rosa afterwards. But here was a guy, and people would line up. They'd show up at 5 o'clock in the morning from all over the country, park their cars in the parking lot there to get into Sunday school. It was incidentally the last time he ever taught Sunday school when he had his stroke. His line, I think, too, is the woman from the National Park Service who was helping. And he said, what am I teaching today? She said, the book of Job. And he said, how the hell am I going to teach the book of Job? He was a mensch. All right, and he proved what is possible, if not getting everything right as president, what you can do with the standing of an ex-president, which no other president, ex-president in our entire history has done. None. A lot of them go out and make a lot of money. Incidentally, Jimmy Carter defeated Gerald Ford. They became fast friends afterwards and worked together on lots of things because both Carter and Ford put the country first, rather than what we've seen in some recent presidents that I could name, but I won't. I don't need to. What more do I say? It looks like we got time for maybe one more comment or question. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ambassador Hunter, in all of your relations with Carter, what effect did he have on you? Because you were in a unique position to have served him during these critical years in the White House. How did he affect you, and how did you change as a result of your encounters with President Carter?
Well, one thing I had picked up to begin with when I worked for Lyndon Johnson, but got for sure in the 4 years, that's 2 hours and 20 minutes that I worked on Carter's NSC staff, is you got to get it right. If you're going to write something, goes to Brzezinski, who eventually got so he just pass it through, you damn well better have it right, because the presidents can act on that, which meant you had to get the best information. You had to find the best people, no matter where they were, in the government, outside the government, because you're helping to shape the thinking of the most powerful man in the world. And then to have the interactions with him to realize how serious he was and how he was going to probe for insights, that he was going to read what was put in front of him, that he was always putting the country first. And sometimes politically, that was not the best thing he should have done. And he paid a heavy price for that by not always putting his political future ahead of the national future. So in terms of my own approach to international politics, it has set a very high standard for thought, for action, for keeping the morality basis in American foreign policy. Hunter's rule on that is you may have to throw away the moral element, but you only do it at the end when you absolutely have to. You don't do it at the beginning, which too many presidents do. Now let me just say a final word. You people at Troy set the absolute standard for what we need in this country.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hunter. It was truly a pleasure to hear your thoughts and to talk to us about President Carter. Thank you so much.
Thank you.